2001, South Africa found itself in the grip of gold fever.
It escalated beyond control.
A small-town businessman might have stumbled upon a long-lost fortune, the Kruger millions.
There was talk of £1 million and more.
This was the reputed war chest of legendary Boer statesman Paul Kruger. But in the confusion of a savage war, it disappeared.
People believed that some of the coins was hidden somewhere, was buried.
For over a century, treasure hunters had been seeking this elusive hoard of gold and chasing the legend of one rogue soldier who claimed to know its location.
And he became known as the man who hid the Kruger millions.
This is the story of a missing fortune, a double-crossing spy, and a wary skeptic swept up in the adventure of a lifetime.
But when you see that, it's like, oh my God, this is true. I was completely convinced that this was the Kruger millions.
May 1900. The first war of the 20th century, the Boer War, was raging. In the midst of this brutal conflict, a vast fortune unaccountably vanished. According to legend, it was buried somewhere in the wide-open grasslands of the South African bushveld. This treasure, named in honor of Paul Kruger, one of South Africa's founding fathers, is known as the Kruger millions.
I believe probably a very large percentage of South Africans know about the Kruger millions, and you'll actually be amazed how many people are actually aware of it.
The Kruger millions consists of an untold number of solid gold coins, each bearing the head of Paul Kruger himself. They were minted to fund his people's fight against the greatest superpower of the day, the British Empire.
This is one of the 1900 pounds. This is gold, 95% pure gold, hardened slightly with some other material because pure gold is very soft.
The most valuable of these so-called Kruger pounds can fetch up to £6,000 each at auction.
It's not because they're gold. These are valuable because they have a connection with South Africa's history.
Ever since the end of the war in 1902, people have been searching for this treasure trove of buried gold. Atholl Stark knew the legend as well as anyone. He is a successful businessman in a bustling town called Ermelo, in the heart of the South African veldt. For most of his life, Atholl never paid much attention to rumors of gold buried in the plains beyond the edge of town.
I'm not a treasure hunter. I'm not a person that every weekend or every day off puts my spade across my shoulder. I'm a business person. It was never a subject of interest to me at all.
But at the turn of the 21st century, an extraordinary series of events would change Atholl's life forever. He would unwittingly become the central figure in one of the strangest gold rushes of all time. His story has the most ordinary of beginnings, when a man with debt problems came calling in 1999.
A gentleman arrived at my home that is very well known to me, and he asked for my help. His motor car was about to be repossessed because he'd failed to pay 3 months of payments.
Atholl often gave financial advice, and there was nothing unusual about this particular client, until the moment he mentioned a relative who had come into some money.
Right at the end said that his uncle was perhaps somebody that could help him because the uncle had coins. He didn't say money, he said coins. And obviously I've zoned in on the coins thing because this was, and I said to him, you're talking about money? And he said, no, coins, like what kind of coins? And he kind of said, coins like this, that size, and it's yellow and it's got Kruger's head on it.
The coins the man described were clearly none other than Kruger pounds. Atholl suddenly saw a chance to strike it rich. possibly this was just some kind of scam. Then again, perhaps, just perhaps, these coins were genuine and part of the famed Kruger millions.
I told him that the only way that I would be interested in even getting involved is I needed to see at least 1,000 of these coins. And it was just a number. It wasn't like a determined amount of money. It was just kind of, I need to see 1,000 of these coins before I would even get involved.
Much to Atholl's surprise, the very next day he received an invitation to visit a nearby black township. The Zulu client and his elderly relatives wanted to meet Atholl and show him 1,000 gold coins, just as he requested.
They came in with 3 paraffin tins, and just by looking at them you could see these things were pretty old. They opened up one of them and they poured out a reasonable amount of coins onto the table.
There, on the table in front of Atholl, were dozens of Kruger pounds, with many hundreds more waiting to be poured out.
Up to the moment where they walked in with those paraffin cans, I didn't actually believe. I thought it was a scam. I thought I was going to get robbed.
In that moment, the mythical treasure had become real.
Yes, they were Kruger coins. Yes, they were gold.
Then Atholl made a critical mistake by trying to inspect one of the coins. As far as the family was concerned, Atholl was there to look, not to touch. He was unceremoniously shoved off the property, and he assumed he would never hear from these people again. However, 2 weeks later, Atholl got a phone call. The Zulu family now had a business proposition. They wanted his help to sell some of their coins.
I managed to find somebody that could purchase coins, set up a deal with these people, and it appears that they were able to sell quite a number of coins.
In exchange for setting up the deal, Atholl was given a handsome reward. 42 Kruger pounds, worth tens of thousands in today's money.
The grandmother's attitude had changed quite dramatically. She basically gave me 2 handfuls of gold coins, and I was made to understand that this was a thank you for the fact that I had helped them, with all the problems that they had in selling the coins.
Once, Atholl didn't believe the Kruger millions even existed. Now, he found himself holding his own small piece of it. Atholl was transformed from wary skeptic into a true believer.
I'd go and open up the safe and line them up on the dresser and look at them in the mirror, because it was just so almost unbelievable that we had something so tangible which is related back to so much confusion about this thing. And you just look at them, it's sort of like this wonder of where these things were.
What's more, if the legend was right, the coins Atholl had seen were just a small part of a huge motherlode, which had been missing for a century.
I mean, this is a fabulous wealth even in that time. Now it's billions of rands if all records are to be believed. If we look at this information, what happened to that money? We started to ask a lot of people a lot of questions.
If Atholl could find it, he would be wealthy beyond imagination. But before he could begin to dig for gold, he had to delve deep into the past. He needed to know the truth behind the Kruger millions and how it disappeared. Atholl's research took him right back to the late 19th century. At that time, South Africa was a divided country. The undisputed power in the land was the British Empire. But the Boers, Afrikaans-speaking white farmers, held a large swathe of territory and refused to join the imperial fold.
The Afrikaners wanted freedom from the British, just as much as we colonials wanted freedom from the British in 1776.
The British had tolerated Boer autonomy for years, but in 1886, everything changed. The world's richest goldfields were discovered in the heart of Boer territory. Britain wanted them for herself.
When the Boers did not just want to willingly hand over the country, and because of the gold that had been discovered in the Witwatersrand, which is the Johannesburg area, they invaded South Africa with thousands and thousands of British troops.
War was inevitable, and it broke out on the 11th of October, 1899.
The British government and the military thought this was going to be a pushover. This would be over by Christmas.
The Boer survival depended on the cunning prowess of their political leader, Paul Kruger.
Paul Kruger was an Afrikaner or Boer whose shadow was cast all over South Africa in the second half of the 19th century. He almost personifies Boer independence.
From this modest house in his capital, Pretoria, Kruger orchestrated a two-pronged plan for victory. First, he had to keep his country's gold out of British hands. He ordered millions of ounces to be extracted from the country's mines and sent for safekeeping to this building, the Transvaal Mint. Here, almost all of it was turned into coins, each worth £1 South African pound.
Nobody outside the government knew how much gold there was in state possession now. There was talk of £1 million and more, but nobody really knew.
Second, Kruger knew his small citizen militia could never defeat the mighty British army in head-to-head combat. So he told them to rely on guerrilla warfare.
It was hit-and-run tactics. Men who were not expected to have any military background turned out to be quite good strategists.
For several months, the fast-moving Boer armies had the advantage. One of their best fighters was a young officer named Fritz Joubert Duquesne, a man who would soon become inextricably linked to the legend of the Kruger millions.
Fritz was born in South Africa, and he was educated at schools in South Africa and then in Britain, where he claimed to become the handsomest man in Europe and the finest swordsman in Europe. And he returned to South Africa to participate in the Boer War.
Like most Boer fighters, Duquesne had a family farm in the heart of the war zone. But while the men were at the front, the women were left to tend it on their own. The British knew this, and infuriated with their inability to defeat the Boers in a so-called fair fight, they resorted to an utterly ruthless strategy: scorched earth.
British army devastated the region by destroying all the farms, removing all the people, putting them into concentration camps.
One day, the British came calling to the Duquesne family farm.
His farm was totally destroyed, crops burned, and family imprisoned. Of course, they had no defense against the British soldiers.
The soldiers reportedly raped and killed Duquesne's sister, and then raped his mother, before taking her away to a concentration camp.
Fritz's family were imprisoned, and that's where his mother died. He developed this great hate for the British, and he had this hate all his life.
Duquesne declared himself Britain's arch-enemy, vowing to kill 100 Englishmen for every drop of his family's spilt blood. What's more, he hatched a daring plan to strike at the empire itself. He would ensure that Britain would not be able to claim a single ounce of South African gold. If he pulled it off, he would be a hero, and possibly a very rich man. By late May 1900, the Empire's army was at the gates of Pretoria. With the vaults full of gold under threat, Paul Kruger took drastic action to save his struggling nation and its vast riches.
On Monday, the 4th of June, the gold was weighed, put into boxes, They were put onto wagons, and by about noon they were taken to Pretoria station, where they were put onto a train.
In broad daylight, every penny of the money was rushed through the streets of Pretoria. At the station, a special train was prepared to carry it to safety.
And this was happening just literally minutes before the British invaded the area.
As the train moved off, the first British shells were bursting around them.
The plan appeared to be a brilliant success. When the British finally arrived in the city, they found that Kruger was gone. And so was all the gold. The mint was empty. But to get the gold out in time, Kruger had blown one of his best-kept secrets.
The whole way of how the gold was removed from the mint on Church Square really started the Kruger million rumor. And there's a wonderful story about that, because it was done in the open.
Kruger had to get the gold to Europe, where he could buy arms and supplies for his ragtag army. But the British controlled the entire South African coastline, and most of the railways too. Kruger was trapped, and so was the gold. The only possible exit was via Delagoa Bay in the neighboring Portuguese colony of Mozambique. The gold-laden train sped for the border.
This train was on the railway line from Pretoria to Delagoa Bay, and this railway line was the only one that was not in British hands yet. The government withdrew along the railway line towards a little town called Machadodorp.
Machadodorp was the last town in Boer territory, and in the dead of night, the train stopped there. On this unassuming railway siding, Kruger ordered a small party of officials to set up a government in exile. Leaving them behind, Kruger himself escaped to Mozambique. But, fearing capture on the high seas by the Royal Navy, he left without the money.
The money was on the train, and the train was parked at Machadodorp. After that, it kind of gets a bit foggy, because in a war situation, there's not a lot of bookkeeping and note-taking of what's really going down.
Into this fog of war stepped none other than Fritz Duquesne. After the death of his family, Duquesne had become one of the most notorious guerrillas in the Boer army, nicknamed the Black Panther of the Veldt. Knowing his exploits would endear him to the Boer High Command, Duquesne went to Machadodorp and offered to help protect the gold.
He had fought in a couple of battles, and he also claimed that he was a relative of Piet Joubert, who was a military leader among the South Africans, and so it was not difficult for him to be placed in charge.
By now, the British were closing fast on the few remaining Boer strongholds. The Kruger millions were in great danger. To save them, Duquesne was apparently entrusted to take the lot by wagon and bury it in a secret location. A party of soldiers was assigned to accompany him, but sworn to secrecy. Duquesne did not tell them they were escorting a great fortune in gold. Only Duquesne knew what was really in the wagons.
There were about 30 wagons, and as they penetrated further, many of the men found out that there was gold. They didn't realize there was gold in bullion in the wagons, and so they wanted to steal it themselves.
The wagon train spent 2 weeks trekking through the veldt, avoiding the ever more frequent British patrols. As it traveled, Duquesne's companions plotted to kill him and steal the money. Their moment came at a remote campsite. In the dead of night, one drove a knife into Duquesne's bedroll, thinking he was inside. He wasn't. The bedroll was stuffed with clothes, and Duquesne was hiding in the shadows with his rifle. The next morning, Duquesne ordered his African servants to bury the gold in a cave, somewhere near the town of Ermelo. He then set them free on the promise that they would never divulge its location.
So one of his sobriquets became the man who hid the Kruger millions.
Duquesne's plan was simple. If the Boers won the war, then he would simply uncover the gold and return with it to Pretoria, claiming a hero's welcome, and no doubt a handsome reward. If they lost, then all the money would be his to keep.
Fritz took the gold, as he would claim, for patriotic reasons, because when the Boer government was restored, the gold could be used. But primarily, it was greed. I'm sure it was greed.
But war has a habit of wrecking even the best laid plans. Several months after burying the gold, Duquesne was ambushed by a British patrol. He survived the attack, but he was now a captive of his arch-enemy. And the British had a special treatment reserved for the most dangerous, irreconcilable Boer fighters such as him. They exiled them 8,000 miles away to one of the farthest flung corners of the empire.
There were a number of Afrikaners, or Boers, who were bitter enders, or bitter einders, I believe they called themselves, who would not capitulate, and these were sent to Bermuda. And Fritz was one of those who was sent to Bermuda.
In 1902, the Boer War ended with a British victory. The irony was not lost on Fritz Duquesne, marooned in Bermuda. He no doubt believed the Kruger millions now belonged to him. If only he could make it back to South Africa. Duquesne escaped from his prisoner of war camp and stowed away on board a yacht bound for New York. But in America, Duquesne was diverted by the prospect of becoming a popular hero.
Fritz used his background to bring celebrity to himself, and he did this by lecturing on his adventures in South Africa. He was his own best promoter, and he was a very good speaker, and as much as he hated the British, he spoke with a British accent.
Why should Duquesne dig for buried gold when he could sell stories about it? He began to make a handsome living as the man who hid the Kruger millions. Meanwhile, word of his exploits soon made it back to South Africa. They became mixed up with the rumors about Paul Kruger and his dramatic escape on a train full of gold. The legend of the Kruger millions was born.
There are various stories. Everybody knew somebody who had seen it being done, but nobody had seen it being buried. There was the story of people having buried some of the coins near Ermelo.
Of all the possible places where the treasure could be buried, one of the most likely was Ermelo, Atholl Stark's hometown. By the end of 1999, Atholl had developed a serious case of gold fever. His research revealed that Ermelo had been a hotbed of treasure hunting for decades. Many people in town had managed to strike it rich down the years. Perhaps he could be the next. The first were a pair of impoverished Boer farmers, 80 years previously.
In 1921, two brothers were building a small dam to try and catch the spring water for their cattle. And while they were digging there, they came across something.
What they discovered was a buried cache of golden Kruger pounds. Within days, they retired to live a life of leisure.
They said that they had got an inheritance from Uncle Paul.
Uncle Paul was an affectionate name for Paul Kruger. In the years that followed, a number of other farmers in the area also became mysteriously wealthy, thanks to old Uncle Paul.
At the end of the Anglo-Boer War, Afrikaners went into poverty. These people were what could be called destitute. But there's a problem here. The people were able to rebound very quickly. You know, within a couple of years, they had herds of sheep and herds of cattle, and the question is, where did all this stuff come from?
Atholl realized they all had something in common. All of them were working near the edge of this salty lake, about a mile outside Ermelo. It was near this same lake that a Zulu family made another discovery 40 years previously. It was a tale that chilled Atholl to the bone.
The big uproar in our town was the coins that were found during the 1960s by a family of black people who worked as farm workers on the farm, actually the farm next door.
In the middle of the night, one member of the family noticed a group of white Afrikaners digging ditches near the salt lake. So one Sunday afternoon, when everybody was at church, they went to investigate.
When the workers were not there, the farmer was not on the farm, and after themselves digging at the spots where these people had been digging. Came across a container, pulled it out of the ground, and it was full of coins. How many? It's impossible to know. It took them apparently a couple of hours, but every container that they had, from cooking pots to kettles to paraffin tins, they loaded it up with the money that they pulled out of this box. And then, of course, the problem was, what do you do with this money?
These were the bad old days of apartheid. And for a black person to be seen with even one Kruger pound, let alone a whole box full, was an invitation to serious trouble.
They realized that, you know, if they hid it in the floor, that it would be found, whatever they did. That afternoon, there was a funeral, an elderly gentleman that had passed away. So they took the money and put it at the bottom of the grave and covered it with soil.
Sure enough, the white treasure hunters returned that evening to keep looking for the Kruger millions. Instead, they found their secret digging site had been torn apart. They stormed into the Black Township, looking for their gold.
They demanded to know what had happened, who'd been digging down there, and nobody, of course, was prepared to tell them. So what they did is they grabbed one of the daughters of the people that lived there. And whipped this child in front of everybody, trying to force them to tell them. Of course, nobody knew anything, so they got away with it.
The white men left town, and a couple of weeks later, the Zulus secretly returned to the gravesite where they had buried the money. They dug up their hidden stash of gold, reburied the corpse, and ran for their lives.
They not only left the farm, but also left Ermelo, and they went to live in a neighboring town.
This family was the very same one that Atholl encountered in 1999. He had discovered their dark secret. Now it was his secret too. Atholl knew exactly where they had found their coins. He knew others had found money in the same place, He knew about the wagon loads of gold passing through the area during the war. Putting all the evidence together, Atholl believed that Ermelo was the hiding place of the Kruger millions. If he was right, the mother lode might be right on his doorstep, and he could be the one to find it.
Whether that's the entire Kruger millions or again just a portion adds a lot of weight to the fact that it appears that there probably was something called the Kruger millions.
Early in 2001, Atholl was making plans for his own dig when someone approached him. Incredibly, this man also knew about the fields of gold near the salty lake and Atholl's role in the story. He wanted Atholl to negotiate access with the white farmers who owned the land. Atholl agreed to join him. For the first time, he became a treasure hunter.
We arranged access for them onto the farm, went onto the farm, and they were there for quite a few hours. They brought like a witch doctor called a sangoma. He continually asked for me to be moved away and moved away.
Go away, you devil! Just go! Go away! Go away! Go!
I was about 250 meters away, up on the side of a hill. And I ended up just going right over the top of the hill and lying down in the grass and watching them. And all he was doing, he was walking around and he kept on going back to this one place. And they dug there for a while. And then they called me and they'd found something. What they discovered was this box. Once they got it out, you could see quite clearly it was money.
Astoundingly, the witch doctor had discovered gold.
I think that's the reality kind of hit home is that, oh my goodness, this is actually the truth.
Back at Atholl's house, the count began in earnest.
Yeah, it was quite amazing. Thousands of coins. We estimate, if we correct, about 14,700 was kind of where we stopped.
At last, Atholl was about to strike it rich. Under the agreement he struck with his new partners, he was entitled to a portion of anything that was found.
When you see that, you know, it becomes almost like an emotional thing. It's like you stand there and go like, oh my God, this is true.
However, before he could claim his prize, Atholl's wife made a crucial mistake.
It was inside our house on a table, and we tried to take a photograph.
What is she doing here? What are you doing? Are you...
When they saw that she'd taken a photograph, they rolled this thing up pretty quickly and left. And we couldn't even stop them. It's guys that suddenly became very aggressive because they had said if we found the coins, they will share the coins with us, they will share it with the farmer. That kind of ended just there and then.
Before Atholl or anyone had time to react, the men had jumped in their car with all the money. They were gone, and so was Atholl's share of the gold.
The shock was 2 or 3 minutes after they drove out my driveway, oh my goodness, they're just driving away with us. And there's nothing I can do. What am I going to do? Phone the police and tell them somebody just stole the Kruger millions? The cops are going to laugh at me. So they just literally just drove away with us, and there was absolutely nothing I could do.
Within a space of hours, Atholl had found a fortune and lost it again. There seemed little hope of Atholl ever having his own piece of the Kruger millions.
We honestly believed that we'd found, this is the Kruger millions. We honestly believed it. and they loaded it on and they were gone. That was where you actually almost feel sick, that you actually feel quite ill, that this thing had actually happened while you'd actually stood and actually watched it.
And yet, he still had one more trump card up his sleeve. Very few people knew the exact location where these coins had been uncovered. There had already been at least 3 discoveries of coins near the salty lake. But if the legend was true, they were just the tip of a golden iceberg. Why not return and try to find the main stash? By the middle of the year, Atholl was back in the hunt for more gold. And this time, he made his own extraordinary Kruger find.
About 2 kilometers out of town, there's a place that used to be the old way station. And one of the guys there phoned me and said to me, listen, I think you need to come and have a look. We found a statue buried on the property of Paul Kruger.
It was not a cache of Kruger pounds, but a stone pillar bearing Kruger's head. Despite the fact he was keeping the Kruger gold a closely guarded secret, Atholl thought the Kruger statue could bring some recognition to his small town. He invited the South African Broadcasting Corporation to Ermelo. He assumed he could publicize the statue while also maintaining a news blackout about the gold. He could not have been more wrong.
The guy asked me a bunch of questions, and when I'd finished answering all the questions about the statue, he then turned around and said, with the mic kind of shoved up in my face, and I said, okay, now tell us all about these coins that people are finding, And immediately, without thinking, I said to him, hold it a moment, turn that camera off, there's no ways I'm answering that question. And without even realizing, the cat was out of the bag.
If Atholl's connection to the treasure had been a secret before, it wasn't now. Sure enough, on that evening's news, Atholl's vehement denials were broadcast to the nation. Within days, hordes of treasure hunters descended on Ermelo.
It escalated beyond control over the next few weeks. So much so that I was being accosted in the streets by local people who either wanted to know what the story was, or blatantly just said, this is nonsense, what are you doing to our town?
Atholl was now a hunted man. Stories appeared as far away as London and Hong Kong about the Kruger millions, and they all named Atholl as the one who knew where they were buried.
That led to us just getting to the point. It was just like, hold it a moment, this is just getting too much now. Our lives were being pulled apart. We would walk past our kids' bedrooms and the curtains would be open, and you'd look over into the park next door and there'd be people on the top of the roofs of cars taking photographs of my family, and just like, hold it a moment, this is going too far.
With gold fever spreading rapidly through Ermelo, Atholl lost any chance of finding the missing motherlode of the Kruger millions. It was a crushing blow. But in the midst of his despair, Atholl had an idea. There was a way to end the gold rush nightmare and placate the gold-hungry fanatics thronging his town. A treasure hunting weekend, open to all comers.
People came already from the Friday. We set up some tents and security guards and things like that. We had a big official gold rush opening where the Mrs. South Africa came and officially cut the ribbon, and all these people ran in on the farm.
Best of all, Atholl could still make some money himself. Everyone who wanted to dig had to pay him a fee.
We had already 116 people that had in actual fact booked to actually come and dig here today.
People came in their droves, and anticipation was high. In the first few hours, some more gold coins were uncovered. Then, nothing. Holes were dug in every conceivable hiding place, to no avail. After 2 days of continuous searching, the Kruger millions were nowhere to be found. The few artifacts that were unearthed couldn't even be given away.
These are things that have been dug up, some of them dug up directly at the place where the gold coins were found. The first one is just obviously a piece of quartz that was probably something that was on a mantelpiece. And then various other things, a little statuette of the Holy Family, another statue of Queen Victoria.
The treasure hunt was over, and soon afterwards, Atholl decided to put the whole affair behind him. He sold his small collection of Kruger pounds, and he has not been back to the salty lake until today.
The hole that I'm sitting in at the moment is in actual fact the hole where the Zulu-speaking family found quite a large number of coins in the early 1960s. Quite a distance from us, about 400 meters from us, in that open patch of ground over there, they dug quite a large hole, and I actually observed more than 14,700 coins being removed out of the ground.
Atholl's quest for the Kruger millions was over. But the search for answers had only just begun. Where did all that gold come from? And where was the rest of the money? Beyond a few coins, could the Kruger millions be just a myth? One possible answer lies with Fritz Duquesne, the fanatical Boer soldier who claimed to have buried 30 wagon loads of gold.
Whenever I hear the name Fritz Duquesne, I get a wry smile. I mean, if there is something happening, and if there's intrigue, he will be involved.
For years after the Boer War, Duquesne continued to live as a minor celebrity in the United States, making his name as the man who hid the Kruger millions. Yet long after the conflict ended, he still carried a burning hatred for the British, blaming them for the death of his family and the demise of his country. During the Great War, he became a spy for Germany, simply to take revenge against Britain. At the outbreak of the Second World War, he volunteered again, this time for the Nazis.
I never came across any information that he had any sympathy for the Nazis or necessarily any sympathy for the Germans. It was his hatred for the British. It was his way of striking out against the British and hopefully, as he wanted to destroy the British nation.
Duquesne was ordered to spy on the American arms industry and report on the convoys leaving New York for England. However, his German handler was, in fact, a double agent. This extraordinary footage of Duquesne passing secrets was secretly recorded through a two-way mirror in a carefully orchestrated FBI sting. In the summer of 1941, Duquesne was arrested, along with dozens of co-conspirators.
It made big news. There were 33 of them, and people weren't even aware this was going on. And then suddenly this news broke that a German spy ring was rounded up and captured in New York City.
To this day, the so-called Duquesne spy ring is the largest ever uncovered on American soil. Duquesne was sentenced to 18 years in prison. When he was released in 1954, he was a broken man.
He just managed to eke out an existence living on welfare.
Throughout his life, Duquesne swore that one day he would return to South Africa and uncover the Kruger millions. In fact, after his exile to Bermuda in 1902, he never saw his beloved homeland again. Fritz Duquesne died, penniless and discredited, in New York in 1956. But could it be that in a cave somewhere in the veldt, there are wagon loads of Kruger pounds that Duquesne buried half a century earlier?
Well, for the sake of Fritz, I like to think there was, but I don't know. There's really no, all we have is his word for it, but his story is as good as any, I guess. Someone get some shovels and go out there and start digging.
If Duquesne did hide the Kruger millions, then his secrets died with him. So what is the true fate of this elusive treasure? There is no doubt that all of Kruger's gold was loaded onto a train in Pretoria in June 1900. But precisely how much was there? There has never been a full account of the gold's true value. So it's entirely possible that all of the treasure hunters down the years have been chasing a shadow.
Once the Transvaal government had nationalized about 10 mines at the start of the war, in those few months, they only amassed about 100,000 pounds of Kruger coins per month for about 5 or 6 months.
From the start of the war to Pretoria's fall, they could have made, at maximum, about 800,000 Kruger pounds.
So there was never a possibility of millions or even 1 million being available to be buried. It just didn't exist. There wasn't so much available.
There was no such thing as the Kruger millions.
Still, even 800,000 Kruger pounds would be worth tens of millions today. So where are they? Could there still be a motherlode, waiting to be uncovered?
Every later generation had a grandfather who told him about this, who saw the train moving off or saw them packing this into boxes at the Mint on Church Square. So there were people who believed in this.
The truth, sadly, is far more prosaic. For several weeks, the bulk of the gold sat in a railway car at Machadodorp, the Boer headquarters. Word of the train's cargo quickly spread amongst a hungry and impoverished population.
Machadodorp was now a hub of movement and of people, and the public very soon realized there was some gold on that train. And who pitched up? Creditors. And in the next few weeks, they were paid right there in the open.
The bulk of it was given out there in payment of debt.
All the money was quite simply spent. There was nothing left for Fritz Duquesne or anyone else to take away in the apocryphal wagon train. And yet, most of the gold still ended up in the ground, in small amounts, scattered across the countryside.
What you do find are a few Kruger coins that a wealthy farmer had buried before he went on commando in the war.
Boers who were paid in gold Kruger pounds would return home with the money to their farms, fearing the arrival of the British and their scorched earth tactics. The safest thing was often to bury it.
The idea of this, of course, was that these wealthy farmers said, let's keep this and that we've got something to fall back onto after the war. But obviously then some of them were killed and didn't come back, and so that buried piece of gold was never found until a later stage.
This explains the caches of gold uncovered in Ermelo down the years. They were undoubtedly valuable finds, but there were isolated pockets of money, buried by individual farmers. They could not have been part of a great motherlode. There was no motherlode.
My father had a few Kruger pounds that were dug up in a fish pond of an old Boer farmstead.
Still, there is gold out there, buried in the wide open expanse of the veldt. And although it may not be millions, some lucky treasure hunters could still get very, very rich.
Do we believe that this is the Kruger millions? Not the Kruger millions, but we believe that it is a portion. There probably was something called the Kruger millions. I do definitely believe that
the legend of the Kruger millions lives on. Homer's Iliad. It's the greatest epic poem ever written. A tale of the legendary heroes and battles of the Trojan War, when the Greeks fought to win back Helen of Troy.
What you have there is this wonderful cast of characters, this myth.
But for one man, the Iliad's tales were more than just myth.
Homer must be literally true, and it was going to be his life's mission to prove it.
For Heinrich Schliemann, the poem was a treasure map which could trace a path to untold riches. Priceless jewels presented to Helen of Troy by King Priam.
It was gold, and it was immensely valuable.
Schliemann would pursue this obsession for over 20 years.
He had this incredible self-confidence.
He had one idea in mind, which was to find the treasure.
And his story would become an epic in its own right. The tale of one man's hunt for the lost jewels of Helen of Troy. In 1866, the man who would devote his life to finding Homer's Troy arrived in London. Heinrich Schliemann was a rich German businessman with an appetite for travel and an insatiable curiosity. Schliemann found London poised at the edge of an intellectual revolution. Charles Darwin had rewritten human origins, and his findings had stirred a new wave of curiosity.
It was certainly true that the timing for Schliemann was perfect. There was a huge interest in prehistory spreading around the archaeological world.
Until now, European civilization was thought to have begun with ancient Greece. But there was a growing sense that its origins might have been far earlier, that an ancient human past was just waiting to be found.
In Schliemann's day, people had very little idea that there was much prehistory before classical Greece.
To Schliemann, finding the first great European civilization seemed a worthy quest for a rich man wanting to establish his reputation. And despite his lack of expertise, he planned to invest his large fortune in the booming science of archaeology.
It was probably the most exciting thing you could think of doing when he turned to archaeology.
But I don't think Schliemann was going out to find prehistory. His motives weren't so intellectual. He was a successful businessman, retired early, was looking for something interesting to do.
Schliemann was seduced by archaeology's potential to unite his two great passions, making money and the legendary story of Troy.
Whoever could find it was sort of ensured a great and glorious future.
Schliemann claimed to have been obsessed by Troy since boyhood, when he first read the Iliad. Written by the ancient Greek author Homer, the Iliad tells the tale of a great king named Priam, who ruled over the city of Troy at around 1250 BC.
The story of Troy, in a way, had everything for archaeologists, because it had this very rich myth, and it had these characters.
King Priam's son, Paris, caused chaos by seducing the beautiful Greek princess Helen, stealing her away from her husband Menelaus and back to his father's city.
Helen was reputed to be the most beautiful woman in the world.
In response, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful of all the Greek states, launched 1,000 ships to win Helen back and camped a huge army near the city walls.
The Greeks, in a coalition under Agamemnon, get together to take back Helen by force.
What makes it so fascinating is the scale of it all.
After a dramatic 10-year siege, the Greeks broke through, killing Troy's remaining inhabitants and burning the city to the ground.
So there you have it all. You have these heroes, you have battles, you have wealth, and you have beautiful women.
For Schliemann, the most thrilling detail of all was the promise of buried riches. In the Iliad, Homer wrote of Priam's treasure, a priceless collection of gold and jewels that the king had bestowed upon Helen. Schliemann was transfixed by the idea that this gold had been hidden away in the dying city during Troy's final destruction by fire.
This was the image he carried with him.
He was so obsessed by the Iliad that he took the story of Priam's treasure as literal fact.
Homer had said there was gold, so there was gold.
Treasure does not, in fact, play that big a part in the Iliad. It played an enormous part in Schliemann's mentality.
Schliemann believed the Iliad was full of clues for archaeologists to discover, and that by following them, he would be led to Priam's treasure. Most 19th century historians disagreed. They thought Homer's Troy was just a myth, not a real historical event.
A lot of scholars thought that there was no such place except in Homer's imagination, that it was mythological.
But Schliemann's belief was unshakable, and he set himself the task of unraveling the Iliad's clues with the same dedication that had made his fortune in business.
Well, he had phenomenal energy.
He was a man of huge resolution and focus. And once he decided to learn something, he set about it as with a military campaign. But he could get by in 22 languages.
Schliemann taught himself ancient Greek in just a few months. He spoke nothing else and filled notebooks with translations until he could read Homer fluently in the original. The businessman was busy transforming himself into a self-styled archaeologist.
He set about acquiring a knowledge of ancient literature and ancient history, and he was a very capable man, a very intelligent man.
In late 1868, with Homer in his pocket, Schliemann set sail in search of Troy.
He had one idea in mind, which was to find the treasure.
His destination was the Troad, a plain on the northwestern coast of Turkey. Although Schliemann was not the first to seek Troy there, he was convinced that with Homer's help, he could succeed where others failed.
Since the 19th century, people have gone to look for Troy in the northwestern corner of what is now Turkey. But that's a very big area.
Searching the Troad was never going to be easy. The area covered almost 100 square miles. And Homer's Troy was 1,000 years older than ancient Rome. It would inevitably be submerged below ground or hidden beneath buildings that came afterwards.
Prehistory was not thought to have any proper sites because they were all buried under layers and layers of later settlements.
Schliemann was hopeful that a hilltop village named Burnabashi might hold the answer. Burnabashi was surrounded by archaeological remains and seemed the perfect match for Homer's Troy.
Burnabashi had some of the attributes that people were looking for, including clearly prehistoric traces of fortification.
It was in a commanding position. It had remains on the top. It had burial mounds. It had rivers at the bottom. It all fitted the description of Homer's Troy very well.
Archaeologists had already excavated the area in search of Troy, but had found nothing. Schliemann wasn't fazed. He had his own unique way to test whether Bernabashi fitted the Iliad's bill. In a renowned episode of the Iliad, the Greek hero Achilles chases the Trojan warrior Hector around the walls of Troy 3 times, before finally slaying him in single combat. Schliemann's idea was simply to take Homer at his word by acting out this famous scene. If Schliemann himself could run around the hill 3 times, then Bernabashi could be Troy. But Schliemann saw a problem straight away. He realized that no one could physically tackle the course Homer had described here, not even the demigod Achilles. He ended up practically crawling on all 4s.
The trouble was it was on a very steep hill slope, and anybody who is taking the Iliad literally, as Schliemann was, could clearly see that that wouldn't do.
Schliemann's mind was made up. Homer was always right, so Bernabashi couldn't be Troy.
He concluded that Troy wasn't there, but must be somewhere else.
Schliemann needed a new way forward. And his faith in Homer and the Iliad was about to pay off.
It is an incredibly valuable attribute to have, to be simply lucky, and I think that Schliemann was.
Schliemann's next stop was a hill called Hissarlik, 8 kilometers northwest of Bernabashi. Standing in the shadow of Mount Ida, Hissarlik was no stranger to suspicion. It was first alleged to be Troy's location as far back as the 15th century. But no one had ever found evidence. When Schliemann arrived, he found the site already occupied by a British archaeologist named Frank Calvert. Calvert too had dreams of finding Troy and had purchased half of Hissarlik's land in order to conduct his own excavations.
The problem for Frank Calvert was he just didn't have the money to do anything on a large scale. So when Schliemann came along, I think he saw an opportunity. Here was a man with a lot of money, and he could get him interested in the site.
Excited by the prospect of a more extensive dig, Calvert let Schliemann into the secret of Hissarlik. What looked like a hill was in fact a man-made mound of earth.
What his excavations showed him was that there were not only Greek and Roman ruins on the top, which was quite obvious from the surface, but that underneath these ruins there were deeper layers of earlier periods.
No one, not even Calvert, knew for certain just how old the hill was. But he thought the site might date all the way back to 1250 BC, the time of the Iliad and Helen of Troy.
He believed there was a real possibility that underneath these ruins was the Troy talked about by Homer.
Schliemann put the mound to his Achilles test. Unlike Bernabashi, it passed with flying colors. Hissarlik fitted Schliemann's mental image of Troy in every way. There was a ruined temple, rivers on the plain below, and a mountain range in the distance. The whole landscape was straight from the pages of the Iliad. Schliemann was ready to dig for Troy, and he wanted to get started straight away. But Calvert said he'd need permission from the Turkish government.
Calvert was a cautious man, the exact opposite of Schliemann.
But Schliemann hadn't made his fortune being cautious. Ignoring Calvert, he employed workers to begin the dig regardless. Permission could wait.
He was a man of influence, he had a lot of money, What he didn't have was diplomacy, which is a useful asset if you're going to dig in a foreign country.
The Turks were outraged when they learned Schliemann was already digging. They demanded he left Hissarlik. But Schliemann wasn't about to give up.
He established many, many connections with the powerful and highly regarded.
He was firing off letters left, right, and centre.
Schliemann bombarded the Turks with a mixture of apologies and threats.
Schliemann's letters reveal a bullying attitude towards the weak and a very grovelling, sycophantic attitude towards the strong.
He knew how to pull strings, he knew which strings to pull, he knew where maybe to grease a palm, and I think that helped him to persuade the Turkish authorities to let him do what he wanted.
After 3 years, Schliemann struck a deal. He would have to pay for all excavations at Hissarlik, and then split any findings 50-50 with the Turkish government. But at last he had his official go-ahead to dig for Troy. So he set to work. But Schliemann soon learned that Hissarlik was a highly complex site. There were many different eras of human history buried in the mound.
The way the mound had built up over time was that one layer had formed on top of another, one after another, like a series of upside-down pudding basins.
Over the centuries, successive inhabitants of Hissarlik had added new layers, each one built up over hundreds of years. Schliemann naturally assumed that if Homer's Troy dated from 1250 BC, 3,000 years ago, then it had to be at the bottom.
In Schliemann's mind, the fact that Homer is at the beginning of Greek literature meant that Homer's Troy must be at the beginning of the succession of Troys.
Schliemann developed a plan that was simple and brutal. He would cut a massive trench, bulldozing right through the middle of the mound.
To do that was an incredibly drastic measure, even by the lights of the 1870s.
Schliemann wasn't like that. He just wanted to sort of cut straight through, find the treasure, build up the picture of Troy, and be the man who discovered Troy.
Frank Calvert was horrified. As a professional archaeologist, he urged Schliemann to take a less reckless approach, peeling away thin layers of soil and sifting evidence carefully.
We can see from his own excavations how Frank Calvert went about things. He would have wanted Schliemann to excavate sort of gently and slowly.
But Schliemann could practically smell Priam's treasure. He wanted to press on, full steam ahead.
Schliemann vitally ignored the advice that Calvert gave him, that this was going to be a complicated site and should be treated with caution. The reaction to this is the beginning of the falling out between Calvert and Schliemann.
Schliemann brought in huge resources of equipment and men. His fortune meant that he could buy all the machinery of open-cast mining.
His object was to pull down great chunks of earth to get down to the bottom as quickly as possible.
There were winches, levers, even battering rams, and perhaps most shockingly of all, dynamite.
Well, his methods do read slightly alarmingly.
He was a thoughtless and clumsy archaeologist. He did not respect sites. He did not pinpoint things properly.
It did mean that a lot of detail was lost to him if he was moving such large amounts of spoil.
Schliemann was often joined on site by his wife Sophia, a young Greek woman, 30 years his junior. Sophia reminded Schliemann of Helen of Troy, and he was desperate to involve her in the quest for Priam's treasure. But so far, his finds were disappointing.
He kept on having in mind that somewhere in this mound there was going to be gold.
Instead of gold, Schliemann was finding only pottery, and it seemed strangely primitive. It was nothing like the splendor of Homer's Troy that he'd imagined.
He wasn't terribly interested in finding shards and little bits of pottery, particularly as they didn't sort of seem to belong to what his idea of Troy was.
His dream of Troy seemed to be fading. This was a treasure hunt with no treasure. The 1871 dig drew a blank. But Schliemann wasn't yet ready to give up.
It was just a question of going deep enough and digging enough, and the gold would be there.
In 1872, Schliemann returned for a second season. And at last, he got some real encouragement and some genuine treasure. His workers unearthed a huge marble frieze. It showed the god Apollo in his chariot, driving 4 horses. Schliemann realized it came from a Greek temple that occupied the mound in around 300 BC. So it was 1,000 years too late to be from Homer's Troy. But he had, at least, found something.
It was a very significant piece, and it must have had quite a high value.
But there was a big problem with the find. Schliemann had found the marble on Frank Calvert's land, and his deal with Calvert was that they'd split the proceeds.
The deal was, between him and Frank Calvert, that fines were to be halved. Well, you couldn't halve a thing like this. One or other of them had to have it.
Schliemann haggled with Calvert as if they were rivals rather than partners.
He was ruthless with people. If things didn't go his way, he could be hard and difficult.
Schliemann offered to buy his share of the marble at what he claimed was its market price. Of course, the real value was much higher.
It shouldn't have been a surprise to Calvert that Schliemann was a cutthroat businessman, but I think he was shocked by this all the same.
It was the last straw for Calvert. He walked off the excavation. For many, losing their archaeological mentor would have been a major setback. But it didn't deter Schliemann. Though inexperienced, he carried on and started to use what Calvert had taught him.
As time went on, he did improve. He did have this training in bookkeeping, and this must have ingrained in him a habit of accurate recording.
Schliemann began to note the precise position of each find and variations in the soil from layer to layer. He brought photographers in to record every detail.
Schliemann introduced photography, eventually beautiful photography. I think they surpass anything done on the site since.
Schliemann was gradually building up a detailed picture of the mound. And by the third dig season in 1873, Schliemann's efforts paid off. Deep in the mound, he uncovered signs of what looked like a prehistoric city. There was a paved ramp, a magnificent tower, and an imposing gate. For Schliemann, it was everything that Homer had described as Troy. He was convinced he'd found the gateway to the palace of the great King Priam.
And there was a gate, and there was behind it a building which he thought might be Priam's palace. So he was definitely of the view that this fitted with Homer.
By the close of that season, Schliemann had uncovered another vital clue.
He had found what he thought was very important, which was that the period he was investigating had been heavily burnt.
This charring and ash was on the layer Schliemann called Troy II, just above the bottom of the mound. Here, it seemed, was the proof he had been searching for. For Schliemann, these were clear signs of Troy's infamous destruction by fire, once the Greeks had laid siege to the city. Schliemann was convinced this layer was Homer's Troy, and trumpeted his discovery to the world. But when the news reached his hometown of Berlin, Schliemann was stunned to find himself the object of ridicule.
The attacks on Schliemann were astonishingly strong and hard.
His whole manner of publicizing them just invited academic scorn.
He was caricatured in the press as a gold digger with a trophy wife. His methods were mercilessly lampooned.
The Berlin intelligentsia thought he was vulgar and provincial.
This mania for gold meant that he was a treasure seeker. He was not a serious inquirer after the truth. And Schliemann found this very hard.
Worst of all, his key findings about Priam's palace and Homer's Troy were dismissed. His methods lacked precision, and his one find lacked a date. Schliemann accused his enemies of libel and lies. But privately, even he was racked with doubts. In Schliemann's mind, there were two particularly serious problems with the site of Troy II.
He did by 1873 realize that the site was really too small by comparison with what you'd expect from Homer.
According to Homer, Troy was a well-peopled city of approximately 100,000 inhabitants at the time of the Trojan War. But the site Schliemann had found was only the length of a football pitch along the side. If Troy II was really Homer's magnificent city, it should be bigger.
This is too small, obviously, for the great city that Homer talks about.
And then there was the second problem. Homer spoke of Troy as a city rich in gold, but all Schliemann had found was primitive pottery. With just 2 weeks remaining in the dig season, Schliemann knew he had to do something to salvage his reputation. He had to find hard evidence of Homer's Troy.
Everybody was very skeptical about what he was doing, and he found any form of criticism extremely hard to bear.
And then, just before the season ended, something happened. Schliemann claimed that as the excavations continued, he suddenly spotted something in a wall of Troy II. He used a pretext to send the workers for an early break, leaving Schliemann and Sophia alone on site. She was, he said, the only witness to the discovery of a lifetime.
There it is. There is this astonishing cache of brightly shining gold. And it's everything he always dreamt it might be.
There were bracelets and necklaces, gold rings, goblets, and so much more.
It was gold and silver vessels and a lot of bronze objects, all apparently packed up into one tight little collection.
It was gold, and it was immensely valuable. So on every score at that one moment, he must have thought, I've done it. I've done what I really wanted to do.
For Schliemann, there was only one way the gold could have got there. It was Priam's treasure, abandoned in the wall as the Trojans fled the burning city.
He had in his hands the proof of everything that he had maintained and the people had not believed.
And this all helped to prove that this really was Troy and that the Trojan War had happened.
Schliemann called his find the Jewels of Helen. As a final flourish, Schliemann claimed that Sophia carried some of the treasure home in her red shawl.
You can sense this unbelievable excitement about what was going on.
Once again, Schliemann shouted his discovery to the world. But this time, he chose an ingenious way to go about it. He summoned his photographer, and in the process, created one of the most famous archaeological photographs ever seen.
He got Sophia to dress up and wear this jewelry and be photographed in it.
The photograph went worldwide. It was a brilliant piece of public relations. Schliemann was now famous.
That, in a sense, was almost his finest hour to say to all his opponents, look, I got the jewelry, and what's more, here it is on my wife.
But back in Berlin, Schliemann's critics were enraged. For them, the photograph was proof once more that Schliemann was a treasure seeker, not a serious archaeologist.
The photograph must have been almost most calculated to drive his opponents completely mad.
The establishment ramped up their attack. And Schliemann's version of events gave his enemies the perfect ammunition. He was caught out by two unfortunate facts.
He said that his wife, Sophie, was there at the time and helped him dig it out. It's totally untrue. She'd left earlier in the season to go home to Athens.
Despite Schliemann's account, it seemed that he had invented a witness to a discovery that had never happened. Schliemann's response was that he simply wanted to involve Sophia in his life's work.
Sophie didn't like archaeology at all, and she hated being on site, and Schliemann wanted her to be involved. He would do such a crass thing.
Secondly, Schliemann was shifty about where exactly he had found the treasure in Troy too.
Sometimes he says he found it outside the citadel wall of Troy too. Sometimes he says he found it on the citadel wall of Troy too, and this is supposed to be an indication that the whole treasure was, or part of it, was made up.
The allegations implied that Schliemann had the treasure faked by a jeweler, and even today, most experts agree that his accounts can't be trusted.
The discovery of the treasure of Priam had been embroidered, manipulated, and was in part totally false.
But despite all of the accusations, the public wanted to believe Schliemann, and crucially, the jewels themselves seemed to back him up. Schliemann had all his finds photographed or drawn by artists for publication. And when experts studied it, the treasure matched closely in style, as it would, if it was all from the same find. For all of the allegations, Helen's jewels seemed to be what Schliemann said they were.
I think Priam's treasure was substantially or wholly genuine, and Schliemann found it more or less as he says. There may be a little bit of confusion over some of the objects.
Soon, critics were the least of Schliemann's problems. The government wanted their half of the spoils, and to keep the treasure in Turkey.
There was an outcry from the Turks, who quite rightly said that the treasure was theirs.
But in Schliemann's mind, he had found it, so he owned it.
Schliemann certainly believed that everything he found was his.
He hastily packed the treasure up and smuggled it to Greece, where it is said Sophia's family hid it in the Athenian countryside. His prize was safe, overseas and successfully out of the government's clutches. But although Schliemann had kept his gold, Now he needed more.
The trouble for Schliemann was that finding the gold was not enough.
To Schliemann, it was now about more than treasure. He had critics to silence and truths he was desperate to prove.
He really wanted to be a scholar, and he wanted to be accepted. He was almost pathetically grateful to be accepted by scholars as a scholar.
Schliemann needed to prove he really had found Priam's treasure by confirming it was made in 1250 BC, the time of the Iliad.
There clearly remained this question about whether he had really found Troy or not.
But in the early days of archaeology, dating finds wasn't simple. The only reliable method was to compare the pottery Schliemann had found near Helen's jewels to a sample from the correct era. So Schliemann resolved to dig at the one place he was certain he could accurately date: Mycenae. Mycenae was the palace of King Priam's great nemesis, the Greek king Agamemnon. So it should have dated from the Iliad's era. And crucially, structures from that period had already been excavated there. If Schliemann could find pottery in Mycenae, he could use it to put a date on Homer's Troy and silence his critics.
I think that Schliemann was so determined to prove that what he'd found was right. It was a sort of desperation in a way.
With his reputation at stake, Schliemann set about his dig in Greece. Once again, he decided to excavate according to the clues in his favorite type of guide, the writings of an ancient author. The Greek writer Pausanias had said that 5 graves of King Agamemnon and his closest companions could be found at Mycenae. Experts thought Pausanias was highly unreliable, but Schliemann followed his descriptions like a guidebook.
What he read in Pausanias was that Agamemnon had been buried within the wall. So Schliemann, ignoring the very fine-built tombs outside the walls, went and dug within the wall.
Within days, he had found something. Tombstones marking out a circle of graves, each lined with treasure, exactly as Pausanias predicted.
Schliemann was led by this reading of a very questionable source to dig in a place that proved quite literally a gold mine.
And one particular find was greater than all of the others. It was a funeral mask, found on the face of a 35-year-old warrior. A famous story says Schliemann cabled the king of Greece with the words, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." Schliemann's literal-minded approach shouldn't have worked, but it had.
The same thing happened as had happened at Troy, that through a series of blunders, he stumbled upon a discovery of tremendous fame and appeal.
But chiefly, for Schliemann, above all of these new riches, he had found sufficient proof to authenticate Troy. The layout of the palace and the style of the pottery told him what a power center of the 13th century BC would actually look like.
He found there what the buildings looked like, what the pottery looked like, what the small finds looked like.
With his newfound archaeological confidence, Schliemann believed that if he could return to Hissarlik just one last time, he could finally prove that he had found Homer's Troy.
Bit by bit, he was beginning to assemble proof for what he was trying to establish, which was the legend of Troy and the siege of Troy.
By 1890, Schliemann had repaired his relations with the Turkish government, and he was granted permission to tackle Troy one last time. His plan to use Mycenae's pottery and buildings to confirm once and for all that the mound at Hissarlik dated to 1250 BC, and that he really had found the treasure of King Priam. By now, Schliemann had recruited brilliant technical help in the form of the ingenious architect Wilhelm Doopveld.
He had a very good understanding of architecture and how to record it, and he had a very good understanding of how to put on paper the complexities of the site.
Under Doopveld's influence, Schliemann was persuaded to turn his attention from Troy 2 to a layer called Troy 6, almost 40 feet nearer the surface. At just 6.5 feet below ground, Schliemann had previously ignored this level, passing straight through it in his search for Troy 2. Doopveld suggested that they try digging for Troy 6 further afield, away from Schliemann's previous excavations at the center of the mound. Sure enough, their broader excavation soon produced results. Troy 6 was a much bigger city, with buildings and pottery matching those that Schliemann had found at Mycenae. Finally, Schliemann believed he'd found the object of his obsession, Homer's Troy. But with triumph came devastating realizations. If Troy 6 was Homer's Troy, then Troy 2, where Schliemann had found Priam's treasure, couldn't be.
I think it must be shattering for anybody to have their own discoveries and their own theses so conclusively disproved without really any scope for argument.
And worse still, in his rush to reach the bottom of the mound, Schliemann had blasted right through the very city he had spent 20 years searching for. In the process, he had destroyed vast amounts of the real Troy and ruined vital archaeological evidence.
He must have had to face up to the fact that he had destroyed a great deal of evidence by the way that he had dug earlier.
When the truth dawned on him, Schliemann was overcome by shock.
Schliemann went off into his tent and didn't come out for 3 days. And then eventually when he did come out, he quietly said, "I think you're right."
It was the first and only time that Schliemann ever admitted his mistake.
That one story of him talking to Doopveld is, in a sense, his acknowledgement of what he'd done.
In 1890, Schliemann went to his grave, publicly maintaining his belief in Troy 2 and the amazing jewels of Helen of Troy, avoiding confrontation of the awful truth. But the mystery of Priam's treasure was far from over. Schliemann bequeathed Helen's jewels to the Museum of Berlin, and there they lay safe until the 20th century, when they disappeared, becoming the lost jewels all over again.
It was rather parallel to the whole story of the Troy treasure, which had always been a mystery.
In April 1945, Berlin, like Troy, faced total destruction at the hands of enemy invaders. The Nazi Third Reich entered its final death throes in the Battle of Berlin as the Soviet Union's Red Army surrounded the city. But when Hitler was dead and the war was over, the treasure had vanished.
Nobody knew where it was. It seemed to have disappeared.
The Russians denied taking it, leaving Helen of Troy's treasure missing once more. Then suddenly, after almost 50 years, Heinrich Schliemann and his finds hit the headlines yet again.
One of the world's most famous archaeological finds, the Trojan gold, goes on show in Moscow tomorrow.
In 1994, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russians finally admitted to possession of the treasure.
They felt they were entitled to it as war reparations for all the huge damage done by the Germans in Russia.
The treasure was in Moscow and was put on display at the Pushkin Museum. Donald Easton was one of the few Western archaeologists invited to view the collection.
There was absolutely no doubt that these were the objects which had been in Berlin.
Easton became convinced that the treasure had not been faked by Schliemann himself. It had clearly been in the Trojan soil for centuries.
What was also clear was that these were objects which had come out of the ground. There was no question of their having been manufactured to order in the 19th century.
But with this recognition came a twist. Easton confirmed what Schliemann probably knew, but could never admit.
What we called Priam's treasure wasn't actually Priam's treasure. It was 1,000 years earlier than any Trojan War which may have taken place.
Troy, too, where Schliemann had found the treasure, had been built in around 2300 BC, 1,000 years earlier than Homer's Troy. So Schliemann's find could not have been Helen of Troy's jewels. But what he had found was evidence of one of the first European civilizations, earlier than anything unearthed before. Today, Schliemann lies in a spectacular mausoleum in Athens. On its walls, scenes from the Iliad meet stories from Schliemann's own excavations, forever uniting their two tales. For many, Schliemann doesn't deserve it.
Some people were very dismissive. They thought he was a charlatan.
Is one of the most intensely dislikable and certainly disliked figures in the whole history of the 19th century.
Yet despite his detractors, Schliemann's legacy is ultimately one of archaeological success. He had discovered an entire period of human history even older than Troy, known as the Early Bronze Age.
It was, and still is, a very important thing in its own right. It's a very important piece of documentation for what society was like in the early Bronze Age, and it was found by Schliemann.
He found something very wonderful, and it makes him an extraordinary character.
To most, such a find would have been glory enough. But for Schliemann, there had only ever been one prize. And although his discovery remains one of the world's greatest treasures, it wasn't Helen's jewels. But then Schliemann himself would never have admitted that. Shrouded in mist and isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, 350 miles off the South American coast of Costa Rica, lies a deserted island called Cocos.
Cocos is hidden away, and for that reason, it was more a myth. Some weren't sure that it existed.
In the 18th and early 19th century, ruthless pirates paid regular visits to Cocos.
There are so many accounts of how pirates buried treasures on this island.
Some say that millions of dollars of gold and precious stones still lie hidden under its coconut trees, rocks, and caves.
If someone was talking about Treasure Island on those days, always was Cocos.
Over the years, hundreds of men have battled against the island's incessant raid. the searing heat and unyielding soil to search for the treasure. Some stayed for months, most left within days. But one man spent 17 years on the island looking for it. His name was August Gissler.
There was no turning back, as long as there was blood in his veins and breath in his lungs.
To some treasure hunters, his was a magnificent passion, but to others, it's a tale of greed and obsession. This is the story of August Gissler's amazing quest to find the pirate treasure on Cocos Island. (1881). A British sailing ship was en route to Hawaii's capital city, Honolulu. On board was a 23-year-old German engineer named August Gissler.
He's the son of a knife manufacturer, I think the third of 11 children. One can imagine that that's potentially a stifling place to be. He was expected to follow his elder brother into the knife manufacturing business and, in the family firm, and instead Gissler put to sea.
Gissler's voyages took him all over the world, and along the way, he met some unusual companions. Gissler befriended a young Portuguese traveler, Manuel Cabral, and they fell deep into conversation.
We were sitting a lot of time together with this young man. They're drinking a lot of rum, and they were telling a lot about families and things.
Over the weeks that they were at sea together, they grew to trust each other and appreciate each other's company.
One evening, a sailor by the name of Old Jack walked by. And Cabral said that he looked like a pirate. Gissler told him those days were over and asked why he mentioned the word pirate. Cabral answered, "Old Jack fits the description of my grandfather's life. He was a sailor and sailed this very ocean."
Cabral mentioned that the reason he was so far from home was that he was hoping one day to reach an island where there was something very special hidden. And he produced from an oilskin folder an account written by his grandfather of his life.
The diary was the autobiography of a pirate in the early 1800s. Cabral's grandfather wrote of how, when he was a young fisherman, he and his boat were blown off course with a broken mast and picked up by a pirate ship.
They were pressed into service and found themselves working for one of the greatest and most notorious and most charismatic pirates of the day, which was Don Pedro Benito, Bloody Sword Bonito.
That was the moment when Gissler was hooked by the story. He must have been really fascinated by this diary of a real pirate.
It was a tale of buccaneers, Spanish galleons, and murder on the Pacific. Piracy was a lucrative industry in the early 19th century, and Bloody Sword Benito ruled the waves.
They would sometimes attack villages on the shore, sometimes they would attack a Spanish galleon. One very famous occasion, they took some priests along with their treasure on board.
One section of the diary made Gissler's heart race. It told of a time when the pirates had just stormed a Spanish galleon loaded with treasure. And they were now looking for somewhere to bury it all.
You can't put in at port with a whole load of jewels without raising some notice. People are going to wonder, where did it come from?
You've got to put the stuff somewhere safe.
can sell tobacco in any old port and it'll move quickly, but you know, you have a golden chalice. It's a little bit harder to work with.
One particular passage really drew Gisela in. Cabral's grandfather described where they were going to bury the treasure.
A few days after our capture, the lookout reported an island ahead. From far off, we could see a huge waterfall and high mountains on each side. Three boats landed the treasure on a shore near a coconut grove. There was a stream running close into the sea.
Gisela read how Cabral's grandfather and the captain followed the stream for half a mile inland and came across another coconut grove where they decided to conceal their plunder.
Now, there were no numbered Swiss bank accounts in those days, so it had to be put safely in a hiding place that had to have two distinct qualities. One, it must be very difficult to find. And two, it must be possible for you to locate it because you have certain information which no one else has got access to.
Gisela now read what seemed to reveal the exact location of where Cabral's grandfather buried the pirate treasure.
I dug a hole in the ground. The treasure was piled into the hole. The captain took exact bearings, but he did not tell me what they were. I took my own bearings from the mouth of the stream in line with the round rock, which is about 600 feet west by south from the mouth of the stream and about 20 feet back of the coconut grove.
The document was completely unique, and I think Gisela knew this right away. It gave detailed descriptions of what the treasure was and where the treasure was buried. Landmarks, for instance, numbers of paces from the spot where it would be buried.
You can understand how exciting it must have been for August Gisela when he's on board the ship. And it becomes more and more clear that what he is looking at is a pirate document with essentially directions to the treasure.
These were the most extraordinary pages Gisela had ever read. He now realized that not only did they give precise directions as to where the treasure was buried, they had never been published or shown to anyone else before. But there was something missing.
While Gisela had an awful lot of information about the whereabouts of this buried treasure, he lacked one crucial thing, and that was the name of the island itself.
"169 days after leaving London, Gisela's ship finally reached Hawaii's capital, Honolulu. By now, he's desperate to know the island's name and needs to raise enough money for an expedition to go and search for the treasure.
Gisela arrived in Hawaii and he immediately began looking for work. It took a while, but eventually ended up finding some on a plantation.
While Gisela worked on a banana farm, he had a chance encounter in a bar with a man named Bartels. Here, he heard of another link to the buried treasure. Bartels told him about his wife's father, a man named Old Mac.
Gisela was to learn that Old Mac had actually known the pirate Benito Bonito as well. He'd been involved in the capture of a Spanish galleon off the coast of Acapulco and had sailed to an island where the treasure was buried.
Gisela's ears pricked up. He wondered if this was the same island as the one in Cabral's grandfather's diary. Bartels handed Gisela Old Mac's chart and said that he had set off in 1852 to search for Benito's buried treasure on an island called Cocos, but had run out of money before he got there.
Old Mac was in the possession of what appeared to be pirate maps and instructions to the treasure on an island that he knew as Cocos Island.
But where was this mysterious island? The chart revealed an island with 2 mountains and 2 bays at the northeast and northwest ends. The island's position was latitude 527 degrees north and longitude 87 degrees west. Compass bearings from the 2 points were given where these 2 lines cross, and the treasure's hiding place was marked. And there were even more clues.
When Gisela examined these papers, to his excitement and interest, he discovered that the description of Cocos Island was almost exactly the same as the island that Cabral had told him about.
Critically, Cabral's grandfather's tale talked about 2 mountains. So did Old Mac's charts.
He has finally found out from the Bartels the name of the island, and it's Cocos.
Cocos is famous for buried treasure because there are so many accounts of how pirates buried vast hoards of gold, rubies, and silver on this island, and for various reasons couldn't come back to retrieve it. In many cases because they were hanged or lost at sea.
Gisela is now convinced that the treasure could still be there and is determined to find it. Gisela wrote how before he left, Bartels gave him one word of caution.
Don't take too many hands to the island, and don't let a living soul know what you're after. You might not only lose your treasure, but also your life.
Ignoring the warning, Gisela eventually managed to get a ride on a Swedish sailing ship, whose captain promised to drop him off on Cocos on their way to Chile. But very quickly, Bartel's words seemed to come into play. The ship was poorly manned, and the winds and sea were against them. First, they were hit by a storm. And then worse. They had no winds at all. Gisela described his journey.
We were only 350 miles from the island and thought we could easily make it in a week's sailing, but very light winds prevailed, and 14 days elapsed before we sighted Cocos. At that point, we were becalmed again, and that night we lost sight of the island completely.
the Swedish sailing ship drifted around the Pacific Ocean for another week. And then finally, the captain was forced to abandon the Cocos Island drop-off. They had no option but to carry on to Chile. 73 days after leaving Honolulu, and over 3,000 miles away from Cocos Island, they arrived in Chile, South America, with Gisela still on board. In Chile, the Swedish crew introduced him to a captain of a whaling company who told Gisela he had been to Cocos Island on several occasions.
Once, in 1875, he had fallen in with an American expedition looking for the treasure where they had been digging close to the beach. This interested me, as the plans I had in my possession pointed to the cache being a good way inland.
Over the next few months, Gisela talked to local merchants and dockside workers to gain funds for another trip to Cocos Island.
It takes him some time to get himself together and arrange his affairs, but he manages in Chile to really incorporate a group of investors who are willing to travel with him to Cocos Island.
In late February 1889, and 8 years after first hearing Cabral's grandfather's story, Gisela finally set foot on Cocos Island. Now at last, Gisela can pursue his dream.
Cocos Island lies 550 kilometers off the coast of Costa Rica. It's part of the same volcanic chain as the Galapagos, so it just juts up out of the Pacific deep. It comes from something like 4 kilometers below sea level. It's just the top of a mountain peak. So what you see above the water is just the beginning. It's a jungle with mist and waterfalls cascading off the side of these granite cliffs. And it's really alone out there in the Pacific Ocean.
No permanent human settlement has ever survived here. Now Gisela and his men were the only ones on the island. Over the next few weeks, as the expedition party made a base camp, Gisela got the lay of the land. Looking up at the two mountains dominating the island, he opened his chart to survey the land.
The two were marked on my chart. From these mountains, 2 lines were drawn which joined a good way inland, and a large square had been drawn round the point where the lines intersected. The writing on the plan was in Spanish, but the mate translated it for us as follows. In 1821 we buried treasure here of immense value. After we had buried the treasure, we planted a coconut tree on top and took bearings by compass, which showed locations northeast by east half east to the East Mountain and north 10 degrees east to the West Mountain.
Gisela used the chart as a marker and set the party to work.
They uprooted trees. They searched caves. And they dug fresh approaches to existing tunnels. no avail. And one by one, the party who had come so enthusiastically with Gissler began to drift away from the island until only 4 of them remained.
Gissler and his last 3 companions continued their search. They dug under every palm tree around the square marked on the chart. But after 10 months, exhausted and disillusioned, they left the island in December 1889 and returned to Chile. The following October, Gissler was back on the island. This time, he had a better equipped and supplied treasure hunting party. And very soon, he seemed to be getting results. One morning, Gissler dug up some 18th century Spanish gold coins. But the few gold coins proved to be their only find.
The expedition spent several months on the island digging and boring until we were forced to admit that we had no sure signs that we would strike anything in the near future. We therefore hove up anchor.
Gissler was now tormented with self-doubt. Had he fallen for the oldest treasure hunter folly of them all?
Everybody begins with a treasure map or some secret information that they believe that they are the only people in possession of. And you think, this will take me a week and I'll dig something up and I'll be rich and that will be it.
He didn't find the places they were described, and he didn't find the exact positions. I mean, that's a volcanic area, and the shape of the island is changing a lot.
Gissler went to the island and found that by following the instructions that he had, he didn't find the treasure. And I believe that the realization suddenly dawned on him that following these specific instructions was not going to work.
That realization was an epiphany for August Gissler. Although his best endeavors to find the treasure had all been failures, he would have to try an entirely new approach.
After a number of unsuccessful attempts with one small expedition after another, Gissler realized that the problem was so immense it was not going to be solved by one of these hit-and-run missions.
The key to any new approach, Gissler realized, was to expand the search area.
His plan was that he would go to the most likely place where the treasure was and start digging. And if that didn't work, he would increase his search area, increasingly larger and larger and larger.
The task of Gissler's proposal was immense. It would mean digging up the entire island and would take years. So the only way to do it, he believed, was to live on the island, and if necessary, devote his whole life to it.
I think it was clear to Gissler after his early attempts to search for the treasure that logistics were a major issue, and logistics are expensive. And financing it all himself could happen once, maybe twice, but I think the amount of effort and perhaps the extended nature of the search would necessitate a different kind of access.
To Gissler, the idea of spending long periods of time on the island made complete sense. Over the past 2 years, he had got to know the island's terrain and climate well. The soil, he believed, was rich and ready for cultivating, and there was an abundance of wild pigs, goats, and deer. He thought that if the land was farmed, it could easily be self-supporting for as long as he wanted it to be. Gissler then hit on the idea of forming an agricultural community to live on the island with him. Together, they would hunt for the treasure.
He wanted to colonize the island of Cocos. And he was claiming that he could grow all sorts of things on the island. He could grow the best tobacco. He could grow much more of it than they could per acre in Cuba. Lots of different varieties of bananas. Given that the island is mainly volcanic rock, and it's only got an area of about 5 miles by 2 miles, it was amazing how much Gissler was claiming.
He petitioned the president of Costa Rica to set up an agricultural colony that could be supplied by mailboat once a month, and provisions could be brought on. That would facilitate really a longer-term involvement with Cocos.
In July 1891, the Costa Rican president agreed to Gissler's plan and granted him certain rights to develop the island agriculturally.
He got permission from the Costa Rican authorities to set up a colony, and they agreed that if he could bring 50 families from Germany, they could live on it.
Gissler now had to raise the funds and to find 50 German families. With the colony rights in his pocket, he traveled around Europe, promoting his island scheme.
On those days, the German emperor was very interested to increase German colonies. So, and also this was a little bit the spirit of the days.
After Europe, Gissler then tried his luck in America. The New York Times would write of him, "Gissler is a breathing replica of Michelangelo's heroic statue of Moses. His reddish beard reaches to his waist. His hair is luxuriant on a splendidly poised head. His eyes are as clear and as searching as an eagle's. His nose is classic. His voice is profoundly mellow, fitting the man to perfection. His height is 6 feet 3 inches. He is built like a wedge, as a man should be, with massive shoulders. His hand is as big as the hand of Providence and so hard that his clenched fist is used as a spike maul." Nowhere were there any takers, not in Europe or America. Gissler was now desperate to get back to Cocos, but he was unable to raise the funds or the people to form a colony. He appealed again to the Costa Rican government to help him.
I explained to the president that it was impossible to raise any capital on the concession I had received in 1891, and he requested me to put down what I now desired, and he would see what he could do.
Gissler spelled out exactly the terms he would need to make the settlement work.
My demands were a gift of 1/2 of the island for myself, the other half to be laid out in sections for the settlers I proposed to bring. It took some time to win my point, but eventually the terms were granted.
This was the breakthrough Gissler had wanted. Now married to his wife Mary, Gissler again returned to Europe. This time, there were plenty of takers, and he was able to secure funds from his relatives and friends to transport the colonists over to the island.
My wife went with me to the island on the 13th of December 1894. From New York we brought lumber and building materials, provisions, and seeds. In Panama, we secured tropical plants, chickens, ducks, and turkeys.
The German farming families began to build houses, and it looked as if everything was going to be all right.
Cocos Island represented everything that Germany of the time wasn't. It was wild, untamed. It's completely raw. It's isolated. It didn't involve being one of 11 children in a family enterprise, making knives. It was him doing his thing.
The first thing we did was to clear the land to plant cane, bananas, vegetables, and coffee.
On November the 11th, 1897, Gissler was even appointed governor of Cocos Island by the government of Costa Rica.
You head so far down a path, that path becomes who you are. And I think he was really happy to be the governor of Cocos Island.
At last, Gissler had the time, the resources, and the people to look for the treasure. He made regular explorations along the shorelines, and one day, there seemed to be another breakthrough. He came across more Spanish gold coins.
He offered parts of the island to his family members. So he really thought that he was securing his family's legacy for generations.
But Gissler's dreams quickly began to evaporate. The government boat requested by Gissler to drop supplies off to the island failed to show up after only making a few trips.
As no more ships came in, it was not long before we ran short of provisions. One of the settlers fell ill, his limbs became swollen, and soon after he died.
Gissler's problems didn't end there. The German colonists, who were promised the land of plenty, were struggling to grow vegetables in a tropical paradise.
Cocos Island has rather unusual soil. It's a grey type of sand or grey type of clay which holds water a few feet down and makes it very difficult indeed to grow anything.
Gissler knew he had to get more provisions if he and the colonists were going to survive and locate the treasure. He built a boat and took 4 men across the water to Costa Rica with him to help with the supplies. When he got there, there was another setback. As their boat was loaded, 3 of the men refused to return with him.
There was no use in trying to reason with these men and telling them what a cowardly thing it was to leave their wives. To bring the settlers over had cost a lot of money, but I thought it would be cheaper in the long run to get rid of them.
But Gisela's problems didn't stop there. When he returned, he found that the situation on the island had deteriorated even more. A plague of rats was attacking the colonists' children.
The island is full of rats, and so it didn't really go well for the colonists. I think that they had a desire or a vision of themselves as wealthy plantation owners, you know, in the Pacific, not as subsistence farmers whose children were being attacked by vermin.
The colonists now rebelled at the island's harsh conditions.
Most of them didn't want to really work hard, and coming from Germany, they are not used to this climate. Wet, 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 and humid and hot. And then they had to build their house, they have to cook their food, and they have to do everything.
As the colonists turned on Gisela, he confronted them.
One of the things about Gisela was not only his mental and physical strength and stamina, but his natural ability to command.
He said that on this island he's the governor, the judge, jury, and the executioner.
I thought they would raise crops and get rich, but in a short time they raised an insurrection instead. I declared martial law as governor of the island, and with my big pistols pointed in the faces of the Germans, I scared them into submission. They laid down what arms they had, and peace was restored.
Yet another problem hit Gisela's plans. His provisions quickly ran out, and he had to go back to the mainland for more. While Gisela was away, the island received some unexpected and unwelcome visitors. A British warship dropped anchor in Cocos Bay. Under the command of an Admiral Palliser, several platoons were dispatched ashore with shovels, picks, and a large quantity of dynamite. For the next few days, they proceeded to dig and blast huge holes all over the island, hoping to find the treasure. As Gisela's wife Mary tried to stop them, she was told to mind her own business. Yet despite all the craters they made, the British didn't find any treasure. When Gisela returned with new supplies, he complained about the incident.
In fairness to the Admiral's superiors and British diplomacy, let us say here that the Admiral was severely reprimanded for his unwanted intrusion on Cocos Island.
But it was a very minor victory, because Gisela's colony was disintegrating all around him.
It was a very miserable community because you and your immediate friends and neighbors were struggling just to keep alive, and all hopes of getting rich had long since gone. What had looked so promising at the beginning when the colonists arrived began to weaken and fade, and one by one they decided that there was no future for them as farmers on the Cocos plantation.
In 1902, Gisela and Mary were the only ones left on the island. But even then, Gisela was determined not to give up. Gisler had now been searching for over 16 years. And despite all his suffering, he was still convinced he could find the pirates' buried treasure. Out looking for it, he came across a large sign, hand-carved in the bark of a tree.
It said, "The bird is gone." And the question is, what does that mean? Who wrote it?
Was it a cryptic message? Did the bird mean the treasure? Had someone taken it? Had all Gisler's efforts been in vain?
I think the thing that is poignant to me is, do they know that the treasure is gone, or do they think that the treasure is gone? And I wonder how much that played on Gisler's mind all of the time after he'd found out.
Gisler was distraught. Questions began racing through his mind. Did one of the pirates return to the island to retrieve the treasure only to find out one of his shipmates had been there before him? Things were now really getting very desperate for him. No ship had called at the island for nearly a year. He had no ammunition left to shoot game, and he knew he had to make another trip to the mainland for them to survive.
There was no one on the island anymore besides his wife. It must have been a very great relationship. I mean, really very romantic. Every other woman probably would have left and said, well, I have this crazy guy.
Gisler patched up his small handmade boat again. He had no material left to make a sail, so he created one with some sheets off their bed. Gisler told his wife Mary he would be away for no longer than 4 to 6 weeks and set off to buy the supplies. But things didn't go to plan. As soon as he left Cocos, Gisler hit a terrible storm. And ended up in Panama, over 200 miles on from his original destination, the mainland of Costa Rica. Meanwhile, Gisler had left Mary completely abandoned.
So you have his wife living on the island on her own, one woman on her own, on an island in the middle of the Pacific, with only the barest rudiments for capturing her food. She created traps, she caught things. Did she eat rats? Perhaps.
There was no one taking care for her, and she could easily have died on the island.
You can imagine how difficult that must have been for her.
Gisler finally made his way back to Cocos Island 6 months later. But this experience and the constant struggle to exist on the island finally got the better of them. Gisler left the island with Mary in 1908. They settled in New York, where they were supported by relatives. So does that mean that Gisler's efforts to find the pirates' treasure on Cocos Island was all in vain? Gisler had spent 17 years looking for the buried treasure on Cocos Island. But all he had found was a total of 33 gold pieces, minted between 1793 and 1799.
I wonder whether, looking back at the end of his life, did he feel as if those gold coins had somehow lured him into staying on when he should have given it up years before?
In the end, it was just a man who was desperately convinced that there was something on the island. doing whatever he could to find it, but didn't have any new evidence to be able to do it.
It's almost as though each coin that he had found had whispered to him like some mischievous sprite, "There is money here. Go on, August, keep digging."
Gissler died on the 8th of August, 1935. He was 78. In his will, he left half of Cocos Island to friends and relatives. He had estimated the value of his legacy to be around $200,000. But when the beneficiaries approached the Cocos government to claim their inheritance, they were told that because Gissler was only a temporary governor and never owned the island, his will was worthless. But there is another way at looking at Gissler's life. He may not have found what he was looking for, but it's a magnificent tribute to the human spirit that he endured for so long.
Most people that go to the island can only cope with maybe 1 or 2 weeks of digging, because in the end it tires you, it saps you. Even to have the physical and mental fortitude to survive on that island and to dig on the island for a few weeks is phenomenal. To do what Gissler did, which was to never give up, and to spend 17 years looking for the treasure, is a mark of an extraordinary human being.
Once he'd set out on his quest, there was no turning back, as long as there was blood in his veins and breath in his lungs.
Obsessed, maybe, but certainly passionate, certainly resourceful, and he was basically living his dream. Who can fault him for that?
The following words are believed to be the last he ever wrote.
The treasure is on the island, but it will take money and a good deal of effort to unearth it. I have gone through many hardships and dangers, and perhaps shall do so again, but this will not keep me away.
According to legend, a fortune in gold lies buried somewhere in America's Rocky Mountains.
Imagine $33 million of gold bullion just waiting to be found.
The only clue to the treasure's location is a cryptic map drawn by the sole survivor of a doomed expedition. His descendants seek the gold for almost 200 years. But just when it appears to be within their grasp, terrible events unfold.
Rumor has it the treasure is actually cursed, and many people have died trying to find it.
Disease, violence, alleged supernatural forces, all have thwarted treasure-hungry adventurers seeking the hidden bullion.
There are those who believe that this treasure is guarded by some otherworldly force. Something may be trying to keep us from finding that treasure.
This is the story of a glittering fortune, found and then lost in the Rocky Mountains. The story begins in 1993 in Colorado. At that time, Christopher O'Brien was an investigator specializing in unexplained phenomena.
I've been interested in paranormal and metaphysical subjects and UFOs. Anything that has an air of mystery about it, I've always been interested in these things. But along the way, I also wanted to uncover some treasure legends and maybe do some follow-up and maybe do some treasure hunting myself.
During the course of his research, O'Brien was contacted by a mysterious man.
This guy approaches me and he kind of hinted around that he had some evidence that involved a fabulous treasure. And he hinted around that he was involved in looking for this treasure, and I was very intrigued by this. And I kept in touch with him and set up a meeting so that we could talk about it more.
O'Brien arranged to meet the man at a local cafe.
I walk into this cafe and I look around and I see him, and he motions me to the back. He wanted to sit in the corner away from prying eyes, and he sits down and he begins to tell me this story. And he really blew my mind with what he told me.
The mysterious man claimed he'd married into a treasure hunting family. For generations, they'd searched for caches of gold bullion buried 200 years earlier by a doomed expedition led by one of their ancestors. The man said his family was convinced they were close to uncovering the legendary cursed gold of Treasure Mountain. A mystery that began in the 18th century with an adventure into the untamed Colorado wilderness. (1790), Louisiana. At that time, a vast Spanish-ruled area that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the border of present-day Canada. At a small outpost on the Missouri River, a group of Frenchmen prepared for an expedition. Their official mission was to survey the territory's mineral wealth. Unofficially, their plan was to journey to the Rocky Mountains and find fabulous new sources of gold.
Ever since the conquistadors arrived in the New World, there have been stories headed back east of raided Incan temples and looted Mayan cities, and gold dripping out of mountains, and golden masks. And so these tales have been coming back to the East and back to Europe for quite some time at this point.
Among the expedition's number was a journalist. Most versions of the legend give his name as simply LeBlanc.
There's not a lot known about him, but we can speculate. He was the chronicler, he was a historian of some kind, so he was literate, he was educated. And we can also guess that if he came out west looking for gold with a need to increase his fortune, that he would do anything he could and take any risks to find that fortune.
LeBlanc didn't know it, but his lust for gold was about to trigger a chain of events that would secure his place in Colorado folklore forever. The expedition began its long journey westwards. LeBlanc and his men crossed the Great Plains, likely followed the course of the Platte River, and entered the Rocky Mountains. The Frenchmen found themselves alone in a vast, untamed land.
The west of the 1790s it's the frontier to the people who live in the east. They can't even wrap their minds around the enormity of it. They think they know how big it is, but they're not quite sure.
1790s out west, there are no roads, the mountains are huge, there's no stores out here to buy anything. So you're on your own, and there's no support. There's no police force, there's no cavalry at that time. You're totally alone in the wilderness. And they don't even know how big the wilderness is, and it's huge.
LeBlanc and his companions followed local waterways through Wolf Creek Pass and made camp in the shadow of a mighty mountain. The men immediately began prospecting. It's likely they panned in the local streams and found tiny gold flakes. They follow the trail ever higher into the mountains, eager to find the gold source. After weeks of searching, one of LeBlanc's party made a discovery. It was the unmistakable glow of gold ore.
LeBlanc and his cohorts hit the mother lode, and it's beyond their wildest dreams. I can only imagine how they felt. Suddenly, the real prospect of becoming some of the wealthiest people they've ever met or ever heard of is right there in their hands, right before them.
The Frenchman's next challenge was mining the precious metal out of the tough Colorado granite.
In the 18th century, to get gold out of the ground is much more difficult than prospecting for gold. You're going to have to dig into that rock with a pick until your hands are blistered and you're bleeding and sweating.
The Frenchmen smelted the gold trapped in the ore. Before long, they had a stack of 18-inch ingots. The legends state they produced between $5 and $33 million worth of bullion in today's money.
So in just a few months, this intrepid band of Frenchmen has left civilization, traveled across the wide expanse of the West, struck gold, and is now sitting on a king's ransom.
Because of the Frenchmen's discovery, the peak they mined would forever be known as Treasure Mountain. The Frenchmen mined for months. Then a balmy Colorado summer made way for autumn's bitter chill. It was clear to LeBlanc and his companions that they must find shelter before winter set in.
So these 300 Frenchmen have been going all summer long mining. The weather's been nice, sunny, kind of cool at 11,500 feet. But come fall, things get kind of serious in Colorado. They probably realize that the snow could be 12 feet deep come winter and that they really can't stay there.
LeBlanc and his colleagues planned to spend the winter in the Spanish settlement of Taos, 120 miles away. The question was, what to do with their stash of precious bullion?
They didn't really want to bring their gold with them because it's too dangerous. You know, if you walk into town with millions of dollars in gold, someone's either going to kill you and take it, or you're going to raise suspicion. So they decide really that it's probably best to bury the gold. Only they will know where it is.
The story goes, the Frenchmen decided to hide the gold in 3 separate caches. Concealed in secret locations, their fortune would be secure until they returned to claim it. Some legends state they left 8 clues to help them relocate the gold.
They then make markings in the area to remember where they've put it, with supposedly putting fleur-de-lis carvings on piles of rocks so they'll remember where their fabulous treasure is hidden when they come back in the spring.
Leblanc recorded the cache's locations and the positions of the markers on a secret treasure map. As planned, the Frenchmen saw out the harsh winter in the comfort of Taos. When spring arrived, they were eager to add to their already considerable wealth. The expedition headed north to resume excavating their gold mine. But it wouldn't be long before the curse of Treasure Mountain claimed its first victims. Legend states the Frenchmen were soon struck down with sickness.
These men could be ravaged by scurvy, which at that time the French understood they could eat citrus fruit and not get it, but there's no citrus fruit there. With scurvy, you would have seen the men fatigued, you would have seen swollen joints, painful limbs. They just would not have felt well at all.
The pace of work slowed. Men collapsed through fatigue. One retelling of the story states Leblanc fed his sick companions a vitamin-rich infusion made from local nettles to ward off the sickness. But his efforts were too little, too late. His companions were riddled with disease. And now, the weakened expedition was threatened by a new danger. The local Native American Ute tribe was observing the Frenchmen.
The Utes probably don't like watching these Frenchmen run all over the mountain, chipping holes in it, and possibly taking gold that they really thought was theirs. In fact, they are the landowners in their eyes. The Utes really don't like having somebody else stealing their stuff.
It would be akin to having a stranger walk into your house and pop open your refrigerator and say, oh, this looks tasty and this looks tasty, and you'd stand there and put up with it? I don't think so. And neither did the Utes. And after a while, they became suitably incensed.
The Ute warriors attacked Leblanc and his companions.
They really had no idea the level of savage intensity. Arrows whizzing through the air everywhere, tomahawks, lances. You can imagine being one of these men, already fatigued, wondering what is going on. This came out of nowhere. It's an absolutely terrifying experience.
These diseased miners that were all lethargic and really not up to par, they just can't hold their own. They're setting ducks for the Native Americans that are attacking them. And so most are killed right away.
The survivors knew their time at Treasure Mountain was up.
They can see a pretty obvious decision that needs to be made. Their numbers are down, their position is compromised, they're being attacked. They have to save their skins and possibly save their gold.
It seems the men were too few in number to transport the gold bullion back to the Missouri River. There appeared to be only one course of action.
They choose to take whatever gold they might have mined in that spring, bury it along with their other caches, note that on their treasure map, and try to get out of the area with their lives.
The men broke camp, striking east on the 700-mile journey back to the Missouri River. But they weren't safe.
Well, according to some versions of the legend, the French expedition is able to get off the mountain and apparently out of the mountains, out of the Front Range, onto the plains before they're attacked by the Kiowa tribe. This has a completely devastating effect on the party, taking them down to only perhaps even 5 men out of the hundreds who left originally.
LeBlanc was one of the survivors. He and 4 others continued their journey east towards the Missouri River. But without horses and short of food, their situation was desperate.
These 5 guys are in a survival situation. They really don't have much equipment. They're lucky to escape with the shirt on their back.
Many versions of the legend state the men ran out of food. Still hundreds of miles from safety, their only chance of survival appeared to be cannibalism.
The fact that they may have eaten their partners is probably true. Back then, if you didn't have any food and you were desperate, cannibalism, unfortunately, is a reality, especially back in those days when they didn't have much choice.
Whatever happened, the legends state only LeBlanc and 1 other made it back to the outpost on the Missouri River. LeBlanc's companion died within days of making it to safety. The young French journalist was the expedition's sole survivor. What he did next is uncertain. But all versions of the story seem to agree on one thing.
And that's that LeBlanc makes a map. He makes copies of this map. He gives one to the French government, gives one to his family, and then disappears from history.
But as investigator Christopher O'Brien listened to the mysterious man, he would learn this wasn't the end of the quest to retrieve the French gold, nor the last time the curse of Treasure Mountain would strike.
Obviously, you have a 300-man expedition discovers a lot of gold, and you have maps that indicate where this gold is kept, because they couldn't escape with it. So obviously you're going to have somebody that wants to go back and get it.
O'Brien learned the quest now moved forward 50 years. In 1840, a Frenchman arrived in a small town in present-day New Mexico.
According to the legend, a young man arrives in Taos who knows the story of Treasure Mountain. In fact, he even claims to be the grandson of LeBlanc and is interested in finding the treasure again.
It's likely the townsfolk would have dismissed LeBlanc's grandson as just another eccentric prospector driven crazy by gold fever. If it wasn't for the fact he had a map.
Unbelievably, this young Frenchman claims to have his grandfather's map that actually has the 8 clues that will lead him to rediscovering where the gold bullion treasure is buried on Treasure Mountain.
LeBlanc's grandson was a foreigner in a strange land. Although he had the map, he needed help finding the gold's likely location. One interpretation of the story is that he hired a local Mexican guide named Bernardo Sanchez to take him to Treasure Mountain. The two men joined forces to retrieve the gold buried half a century before by LeBlanc's grandfather. Sanchez led LeBlanc and his party of French miners into the mountains. One retelling of the legend claims the men discovered strange markers, fleur-de-lis symbols carved into rocks, and piles of stones, signs matching those on the map drawn by LeBlanc's grandfather.
They get very excited, because now the map is matching what they're finding, the fleur-de-lis on the rocks, so they know they're close to a gigantic fortune in gold bullion buried right at their feet somewhere, so they're very excited.
The men searched the area for months. But they found nothing. Then, the curse of Treasure Mountain struck again. Just like his grandfather before him, LeBlanc was being closely monitored by the local Native American tribe. According to legend, warriors attacked the mining party. LeBlanc's grandson was killed. Inside his jacket pocket was his grandfather's secret treasure map. Only the guide, Bernardo Sanchez, made it out alive. For the second time in 50 years, the curse of Treasure Mountain had thwarted the LeBlanc family. But the quest for the buried gold was far from over, because Sanchez had a secret. He claimed that during the battle with the Native Americans, one of the dying French miners revealed a clue to finding the treasure.
According to this man, Bernardo just needs to find a fake Native American burial mound. Stand on it at 6 a.m. some September morning and watch where his shadow falls. Where his head is, that's where the treasure lies.
Armed with this knowledge, Sanchez spent years scouring Treasure Mountain, looking for the mound. But he never found it. In time, the dying Frenchman's clue became just another part of the now famous Treasure Mountain story. As investigator Christopher O'Brien would learn, this strange clue would play a critical part in the next stage of the quest to find the lost French gold. He discovered that 30 years after Leblanc's grandson's death, a new set of adventurers would take up the challenge.
It was during the 1870s that some colorful characters emerged in the West, treasure hunters. Gentlemen extremely motivated, good researchers, very good at not only digging in the earth, but also digging into historical records.
And it would be in the hands of one such treasure hunter that the Leblanc map would reappear. Legend gives his name as William Ewell.
Characters like William Ewell are a classic in the American West stories. They hear all these tales that have been coming for quite a while now from the West about gold in the hills and mines to be explored, and you just have to pick up a nugget and bring it home and you're rich.
Ewell spent his days scouring the nearby valleys and mountains. His aim was to find the 8 clues marked on his tattered old map and the location of the mysterious mock burial mound. His quest reached the ears of Asa Poor, a man with an eye for an opportunity.
A successful prospector like Asa Poor actually goes out in the wilderness, looks at those different colored rocks, and finds the gold. He's successful. Asa Poor knows what he's doing, and he's shrewd, intelligent, and when he sees an opportunity, he goes after it.
Ewell's quest for a mock burial mound linked to a fabulous lost treasure piqued Poor's interest. Because incredibly, Poor had found a mound that exactly fitted Ewell's description.
Each has something the other wants. William Ewell has the map to the treasure of Treasure Mountain, and Asa Poor has the knowledge of this burial mound. So he knows this could well be the key to finding the treasure.
The two prospectors entered into a partnership and headed off to find the lost French gold.
After Asa Poor and William Ewell head out into the mountains, they actually start finding some of the clues. They find the fleur-de-lis carved on the trees and the rocks, and just like the map shows, they're actually hot on the trail of this treasure.
Following Poor's directions, they arrived at the false grave. Just as the legend instructed, one of the men stood atop the mound at 6 a.m. and cast a shadow across the ground. They dug the spot where his head's shadow fell.
They begin digging, and they dig, and they dig, and they're so excited. They're rubbing their hands together, probably spelling each other because it's a lot of hard work. It's bony soil, and they dig, and they get down so many feet and they find absolutely nothing.
Could it be that this was the wrong mound, or that Yule's map was a fake? Neither man thought so. Asa Poor knew he and Yule must take a new approach.
So at this point, Poor still doesn't give up. He now says that they will try something called mineral rods, equipment that's being sold at this time that at least claims to be accurate and be able to find the gold you're searching for, the ore, whatever you need. These machines that you can hold will find it for you.
The mineral rod led Yule and Poor to a spot 2 miles from the mock burial mound. The men immediately started digging. The legends state they excavated about 4 feet down when suddenly the ground gave way. Had Yule and Poor found the entrance to a secret cache containing millions of dollars of French bullion?
Of course, they think they're onto the treasure. Their heart's pounding, they're excited, they're gonna find this gold.
Poor lowered himself into the opening. Incredibly, he found himself in a clearly man-made tunnel. He crawled down the shaft, keeping his eyes peeled for the distinctive glint of gold.
He gets very excited at this point. I imagine his heart is just pounding a mile a minute. He's looking all over, he's looking for gold, he's trying to squint into the darkness, he works his way all the way to the end.
But Poor discovered the chamber was empty. With no new leads, the men abandoned their search.
They have spent pretty much their life's fortune. They're broke, they're tired, they're exhausted, they're frustrated. They finally just give up the search. Apparently, it was the curse of Treasure Mountain that got these guys again.
But this treasure legend refused to die. A 120 years after Yule and Poor's failed quest, investigator Christopher O'Brien sat talking to a mysterious man who'd been involved in the Treasure Mountain legend's final chapter. The man stated his in-laws were descendants of the first LeBlanc, who survived the doomed expedition of the 1790s. Then he produced something to back up his extraordinary claim.
Takes out his wallet and he carefully unfolds. It looked like silk. It was some sort of cloth material that obviously was very old. It was stained, it was kind of tattered. And he shows it to me and he says, "This is a map to the treasure."
To O'Brien, it was clearly the same map, drawn in the 1790s by the first LeBlanc.
I'm sitting there flabbergasted looking at this thing, and it looks real to me. There seemed to be mountains indicated, river systems. There was some rough kind of writing on it. I didn't get a very long look at it, but it obviously was compelling because it looked very old.
Along with the topographical information were 8 strange markings, clues the man claimed to finding the lost treasure.
What was very impressive about it were these 8 sigils. There was a pair of boots, there was a chalice, there was mountains, there was like a cross. There was different types of symbols on it.
The mysterious man told O'Brien his in-laws had found 7 of the 8 clues, and that he believed he'd recently found the 8th.
So, of course, the first thing I do is I ask him, I say, you know, how did you find this 8th clue after the family's been looking for it for generations? How did you find it?
It's now the man told O'Brien an incredible story about the discovery of the final clue. And what happened next? (1993), Del Norte, Colorado, 40 miles northeast of Treasure Mountain. The mysterious man was hunting elk in the woods. It began to rain. He sought shelter beneath the overhang of a nearby cliff.
Obviously, he doesn't want to get caught out in this type of weather, so he quickly looks around for a place to, you know, hide and maybe hole up for a little bit and let the storm pass over. So he spies this about 3-foot opening behind some underbrush, and he thinks, well, maybe it'll open up.
The man squeezed through the gap and found himself in a passageway.
His first thought was, great, I'm out of the weather. But then as he's sitting there, of course, like anyone, he got curious. And so he started to work his way back, and it goes into the mountainside about 20 feet.
The man discovered the passageway was blocked by a cave-in. He shone his torch across the damp walls. It's then he spotted something.
As he's looking on the wall next to the cave-in, what does he see? He sees a chalice, which he knows from the treasure map is the missing symbol of the 8 symbols that have been searched for by this family, his in-laws, for many, many generations.
All thoughts of hunting elk were overtaken by the possibility of finding millions of dollars of lost French gold. But there was a problem with the man's story. The mountains near Del Norte, where he claimed to have found the 8th clue, are 40 miles from Treasure Mountain. How could he have found a clue to the gold here? Had everyone who'd sought the treasure been looking in the wrong place? Or was the man mistaken? There is one possible explanation how the 2 stories come together.
Since the Del Norte area is on a direct path from where the LeBlanc party would have been running away from the Native American attack, the first one, they could have very well taken either all of the bullion or probably just some of it with them, and that gold was slowing them down. They could have very well buried it in this area that this mystery man is claiming he has found the 8th clue.
So it was possible the French expedition buried a portion, if not all, their bullion at the site in Del Norte. And that LeBlanc crafted new clues to its location both on the ground and on his map. Soon after his discovery, the mysterious man returned to the passage with his treasure-hunting in-laws.
The first thing they want to do, of course, is go in and see the sigil to make sure that his claim is accurate. And the expert of the, I think it was the grandfather, goes in there, and the patriarch is looking at this symbol, and he looks at his grandson-in-law and agrees that you have found the lost symbol.
The family began excavating the cave-in. Their hours of effort revealed a further 12 feet of passageway.
Well, imagine their excitement as they're digging and they finally get this obstruction cleared away, and it was quite sizable. It went for quite a number of feet. And they finally get it away, and one of them squeezes over to look inside, and he finds that the tunnel continues into the hillside, but not for very far, because he yells back out to them that there's a big boulder that appears to have been purposefully put in the way to further obstruct the tunnel.
Why would someone deliberately block the passage? Had it been to hide the gold? The family was discussing how to remove the obstacle when night began to fall.
But they want to give it one more shot before it gets too dark to continue working. And they had brought some candles and they had flashlights, so they're going to give it one last shot.
But the next 3 minutes would turn out to be the most terrifying of their lives.
So he has this bundle of candles and he starts to place them going down the tunnel towards the end where the obstruction is. As he's putting the last candle down on the ground, a snake comes out of nowhere and fires at him and narrowly misses him. I've had this happen myself and I know how terrifying it is, and he backpedals out of there breathlessly.
But he and his family were soon threatened by another malicious force.
As he's coming out from out of nowhere, he's followed by a swarm of bats that are squeaking and acting very aggressively. Instead of just flying out of the entrance of the cave and taking off, they start dive bombing and attacking people, which is very uncharacteristic behavior for bats. And this is pretty freaky to everybody. Bats finally start to fly away and everything calms down. So he starts to light the candle, the first candle at the entrance to the tunnel, and much to everybody's horror, the candle at the other end by the boulder, the last candle he had just placed before the snake came at him, that comes on. Now, I know this sounds incredible, but this is what he told me.
The man and his family were transfixed with fear. How could a candle light by itself? But their ordeal wasn't over.
So as that candle comes on, then out of nowhere, out of the gloom of the tunnel, comes this big white-colored owl.
The huge bird swooped just inches above the treasure hunters' heads. It was one close encounter too far.
This is a series of events that I think would scare anybody, but for people that are in this position, knowing that there's curses on gold and knowing some of the folklore around the area, several of them have said they will never, ever go back. They don't care how much gold is there, they will never go back to that particular location again.
The mysterious man told O'Brien no one had since returned to the cave to try and recover the lost French gold. But after hearing this extraordinary tale, the investigator was left in no doubt. The treasure is real.
Personally, after all the research that I've done and being involved with this treasure hunting family and hearing their story, I am absolutely convinced that not only does the French treasure exist, but there's probably several of them. It's probably been broken into pieces. And it's just waiting for somebody with a lot of luck and some skill and some perseverance to find it.
To date, no one has reported finding a fabulous cache of gold bullion, fitting the description of that in the Treasure Mountain legend. Is it possible the story is nothing more than a myth? Is there any reason to believe the treasure is out there?
Some of the treasure legends in Colorado, since they do have some historical basis, have actually been found. And if those treasures could be found, then there is a possibility that this $33 million, one of the biggest treasures ever buried in Colorado, is out there and will be found someday.
But if the treasure could be real, then so too could the curse.
Well, for all you aspiring treasure hunters out there that want to start poking your nose into the Treasure Mountain legends, be careful what you wish for, because that curse may still be intact.